Let's finish up this autumn landscape painting, and in this final part, we're going to be painting the water and the reflections. And if you just came across this video on YouTube, make sure you check out part 1 and part 2. Those, of course, will be linked down below. Before we paint in this water, one of the first things we're going to have to do is just add some land here below the trees. And we're going to start on the left side here with this small, almost like peninsula that's jutting out into the water. I'm starting with the color yellow ochre, which we used last week, just to add in some value here, cover up some of that white canvas. And also, once that paint is down, we have something there to erase into if we need to. A few areas of this small piece of land are really dark, so I'm going to start with the color black, which I diluted about 10% with distilled water. And all I'm doing is going around with a ripped piece of paper, lightly spraying over the edge of it to get a dark transition there. We also want a sharp line here, which is going to separate this piece of land from the water. So a shield or a ripped piece of paper works best. I'm going to switch over to my eraser now to start adding some texture in there to make it look like some grass or some shrubs growing. Now I'm using a sand eraser here, but you could use any eraser. You don't need this one. The reason I was using this was really just to test it out on this MDF panel. But as long as you're using a standard ink eraser like the Mars Razor or the Staedtler 7058B, you'll be fine. From here, I'm going back to the airbrush with the color black in it, and I just want to add some shadows here. On the left side, there's this small little area kind of that looks like a rock, so I'm just painting that in with my shield. And then I'm just going to work around this area, kind of softening up the edges. And I'm also going to add a shadow right in here. This is going to be the base to a bush that we're going to be painting in next. Of course, we're going to be using an eraser to pull out the highlights on the bush, so it's a good idea to start by getting that shadow in first before we move over to the eraser. I'm beginning the highlights with an X-Acto blade, and I'm just scratching out a bunch of small thin lines to make it look like some twigs or some sort of highlights there in that bush. Then go right over to the electric eraser, which has a sand eraser in it, and just tap in some highlights on the top part of this bush. This part of the video is in real time, and you could see that I kind of move the eraser around pretty quickly, just tapping it anywhere along the top part of it to add some randomness into that area. I'm trying very hard not to be too precise with the eraser. I don't want these dots to look linear or look like there's some sort of pattern to them. I want them to be random. So one of the easiest tricks for me is to just kind of move the eraser very quickly and tap it all around. And as always, the eraser pulls out highlights way too bright. They're pure white right now. So of course, what we're going to do is switch back over to the airbrush and glaze a color over the top. The color that I'm using for this is sepia, diluted about 20-25% with distilled water. And as I'm glazing this over, I'm starting toward the bottom, which is going to be the darkest part where the shadows are. And then I'm just spraying less paint as I move up toward the top where the highlights are. Just like painting in the mountains or the trees in the last two parts of this video, you don't have to be too concerned here about spraying too much paint, because if you accidentally spray too much over the highlight area of this bush and then make it too dark, you can always go right back over to that eraser and erase those highlights back out. So this is a nice forgiving method of painting. So let's get some of that paint in and then switch right back over to the electric eraser. And what I'm doing here is just adding some texture onto this grass area, just so it's not too smooth. I just want to break up some of that paint in there. I'll also add some more highlights to the top of this bush and then switch over to an X-Acto blade to scratch out a bunch of small twigs, maybe look like some small branches in the background or some sort of twigs, something like that, just to make it look like random, make it look like there's a lot more going on there than we actually painted in. So something that looks like this is going to work just fine for me. And what we're going to do now is go right back over to that airbrush and use that sepia color to lightly glaze over the top. Now, the really cool thing about landscape painting is that you don't have to follow the colors that I'm using exactly. You could play around with this and make it a completely different painting. I'm using sepia, and I think for some people, they may find that too dull. It's too much of an earthy tone. So if you want, you could switch it up with much brighter saturated colors like yellow, blue, red, whatever you want. And I think for me, that's one of the most fun things about landscape painting, because you really have endless possibilities. You could change your painting around to whatever you like. So on your own painting, I recommend trying some different colors in some areas and just glaze them over the top to see what you get. I guarantee you're going to have a lot more fun when you experiment and you don't follow everything step by step. At this point, this small piece of land is basically done. I'm just going to work my way around it a few more times, adding some more texture to it, and then glazing some more color on top of it. And one of the best things about this technique is that as I'm using this eraser to add some texture in, I could also change the shape of any of this. I could make this bush smaller, I could make it larger, really whatever I'd like. I'm also going to use a dark green colored pencil and just sketch in a few lines above this, maybe make it look like some blades of grass, some twigs, or some small plants growing there. The reason that I used a colored pencil is just because it's easier for me. Of course, you could just use the airbrush and paint these in freehand. That'll work fine too. Just remember that there's no rules for painting. It's always best to experiment and try different techniques and see what you like most. To paint in this small field here, just before we get to the water, the color I'm using again is sepia. And what I'm doing is adding some random texture in here. This way it's going to make it look like some dirt or mud or some small rocks that kind of build up right before we get to the water. Now this area is pretty far away, meaning that there's not going to be too much detail or texture here. So with this ripped piece of paper, I'm just spraying in a few lines, which are going to be the shadows of the rocks. And I'm also using a straight piece of paper just to get that sharp line between the land and the water. Just like painting in the mountains, I'm going back to the eraser and erasing in between the shadows. Just like painting the mountains, I'm using my eraser to scratch out some highlights in between these shadows, trying to focus more on the left side because the light source on this is left to right. I'm also going to use an X-Acto blade here to scratch out a small thin highlight on the left side of this tree trunk, just to make it look like some light is hitting it. Now this part is kind of fun because you're really just inventing this as you go along. What you're doing here is you're using the ripped piece of paper and the sepia to spray in some shadows, which are going to be in between the dirt and mud and rocks. I want this part to look like a riverbank that's kind of in some shadow because it's moving toward a lower elevation as it moves down toward the water. And in order to make it look like it's dipping away from that field behind it, we're just going to have to paint it in darker. So all that means is as we finish this up and add some more highlights to it, we're going to glaze a thin layer of the sepia over the top of it to darken it. As I move along from left to right, I'm going to do the same thing by adding some shadows in first, then using an eraser to pull out highlights to the left of each shadow. And the main goal of this is that once you add enough texture in, when you look at this from far away, it just looks like a riverbank. It looks like there's some mud and some dirt in there and a few rocks. And this isn't hard to paint. Anyone can do this. It's just so important to let the eraser do the work because as you scratch out paint, you're naturally going to get inconsistencies where some areas are going to be darker and some areas are going to be lighter. And this inconsistency that you get with using an eraser helps make it look natural. And this is very similar to the way that we painted in the mountain. All these little textures and randomness that you get from using the eraser are going to be used to our advantage. Here, it helps it make it look like maybe some grass, some twigs, something growing there in the shadows, almost like the edge of a marsh or something like that. And if you need some highlights sharp and defined, that's where you switch over to the electric eraser like I'm doing here. I'm just adding some of these in to make it look like some rocks are catching some light along this riverbank. And to help set those rocks in place, I use the airbrush to spray a small amount of paint to the right side of each one to make it look like they're casting a shadow. I'm going to speed through the right side of this because it's that same process over and over. And I just want to take a moment to say thank you so much to the newest members of this channel, Cyril and Michael. Michael with a very generous tier 3 membership, so thank you so much. And I want to say thank you to 3 very generous members, Andrew, M. Shibley, and Dwayne. These 3 guys have been members for 6 months, which is so generous and so nice of you guys, so thank you. And also thank you to Robert, Ken, and Pete, all of which have been members for 3 months. And of course, Carl and Mackie Mark. Thank you so much, guys. And just a reminder to the members, if you have any questions or need some help, make sure you leave a comment in the members page and I'll get back to you within 24 hours. Now in this painting, this water kind of acts like a mirror, reflecting the entire landscape behind it. So what we're doing here is basically painting the exact same image again, but in reverse. Ripples in the water are going to distort that mirror image. So we're going to have to play around with this and kind of adjust it and change some things around so it doesn't look like a perfect mirror copy. The color that I'm spraying on now is the sky color that we mixed in the first part of this video, which was a mixture of cobalt blue and some Payne's gray. I'm trying to cover up the white of the gesso, and also I'm just kind of placing in the shape of this mountain, making it a little bit darker. you can see in the original painting that there's a ridge here, and this ridge is casting a reflection into that water in this area. Now that we have some blue down, I'm going to start on the left side of the painting. And the first thing I'm doing here is adding in a dark shadow reflection of this small piece of land that we just painted in. This reflection color is going to have to be the same color as that piece of land, which is basically black. So I just use some blue for now to spray it in to just kind of get it in place, but I'll darken up that color later. And from here, I switched over to the color sepia, which is going to work as a reflection of the trees. I'm using the edge of a piece of paper just to use as a straight edge, and I'm spraying along the edge of it to add in some horizontal lines. What these horizontal lines essentially do is break up that reflected image so that this looks like ripples in the water. Now, when adding in these ripples, you want some basic idea of what linear perspective is, and that basically means anything closer to us on the painting is going to be larger, and when something's farther away, it's going to be smaller. As I'm painting in the ripples, I'm always thinking about that. I'm going to add some down here by this small reflection with some black paint in my airbrush, and I'm going to paint in some very small ones here. These smaller ripples give the impression that this area is farther away, and then these ripples painted with the sepia lower on the painting are slightly larger, so it's going to look closer to us. I'm going to continue with my black paint, painting in this area and darkening it up, and I'm paying attention to the image above it, to that piece of land, and doing the best I can to replicate it in reverse, so it looks like a reflection. Now, in order to add to this effect of ripples, I'm going to use my eraser and erase out horizontal lines. These lines are basically going to be high points in the water that are catching some light. So as I'm erasing with these, I want to make sure I go right over everything, right into that sepia color and into the blue. Now, this part is very important. When you're painting in any sort of ripples in the water, they're always going to have to be horizontal. And the tool I'm using for this is a ruler that has a 90-degree angle on it. And what I'm doing is placing it parallel to the edge of the canvas. This way I get a perfectly horizontal line that I could erase right into. Now, it's important to know that it doesn't matter what's underneath the water, if it's shallow, deep, flat, rocky. Gravity is always going to keep the surface of the water completely flat. So what that means for us as painters is that the reflections and ripples in the water are always going to need to be horizontal to make that water look completely flat. If you erase out any highlights or paint in any reflections that have a slight diagonal to them, maybe slightly up or slightly down, the water is going to look wrong. So it's very, very important to paint these in horizontally. So if you can, use some sort of ruler or some sort of 90-degree angle edge that's going to help you paint these in. I switched over to the mountain color that we mixed in the first part of this video to paint in the reflection of this mountain again. And now I'm switching over to my eraser and pulling out some highlights just like before. What I like to do when I'm painting water in any landscape is use the landscape that I painted already just above the water, kind of like a cheat sheet or a guide. What I mean by that is anytime I see a tree or a mountain or whatever it is, I just go right below it in the water and then replicate it in the water, just making it softer. So I'll use an eraser here to pull out highlights if I want to make something brighter. And if I want to make something darker, I'll use my airbrush, and whatever color I used on the original landscape, I'm going to use exactly the same in the water below. For example, in part 2 of this painting lesson, we painted in this tree and some of the smaller trees behind this larger one. So what I'm doing now is repainting these again in the water, but just letting the airbrush do the work to make these very soft. The color that I'm using here is sepia, and I'm just spraying down vertical lines, letting the airbrush give me a very soft transition along these edges. Unless the water is completely flat on a very calm day, the reflection is never going to be an exact mirror copy of the image above it. Everything is going to be softer and slightly distorted. So as I'm painting this in here, I'm thinking about that. I want these reflections to be really soft. And the best way to do that is just by using the airbrush freehand and letting it do that work for us. Just like painting in the mountains and the trees, I'm doing the same thing in the water by always going back to an area, adding some more texture in it, maybe using the airbrush to darken some areas, or then switching over to the eraser to erase out some highlights, some ripples in it. It's all about taking your time and building these textures up piece by piece. You don't want to rush this. There's no need to try to get this all in one shot. Just spend time on working on a small part of it. Each section here, I probably spent about 20 minutes to a half hour, then took a break and came back to it. Now, I did this painting on a piece of MDF, which is good for practice pieces. It's good for something like this, a YouTube video. So I was experimenting and seeing how well the eraser took to it, see how much paint I can pull out. So I have maybe added some more ripples than maybe you guys want. It's really up to you. If you want to add more, you can. If you want to keep it softer and subtle, you just don't have to erase as much. The more horizontal lines you add with your airbrush and your eraser, the more the water is going to look kind of turbulent, like there's some currents in it or there's some small waves building up from wind. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying before, is that you have so many options with landscape painting. You can really invent a lot of things and change it to any way you like. And you just have so much more freedom in a landscape painting than you do in something like a portrait or a still life. So it makes these very fun to paint. As I'm painting in the reflection of this large mountain, I'm just painting in freehand and adding in some kind of like darker squiggly lines. This way it's going to look like the shadows are getting distorted by the water. And the reflection is going to be dependent on how the water is moving. If the water has a lot of current and some waves in it, the lines are going to be really sharp. And if the water is calmer and there's not many ripples, the reflections are going to be a little bit more subtle and kind of subdued, not as sharp along the edges. So in this painting, I was just kind of playing around with both of them. In the back left there, I made some sharper lines, and in the front here, I'm just making them softer. Maybe this area of water doesn't have as much turbulence as it does in the back. And of course, I'm in no way implying this is what you should do or what you're supposed to do. I just think it makes the painting process so much more enjoyable when you experiment and you try different things and kind of make it your own. I want some areas in the front here to be very bright and add some specular highlights to this, some very bright reflections of light. So I'm using my electric eraser to pull out a bunch of very bright dots here in the front to make this look like it's catching more light. No specific technique for this. I'm just moving it around left and right, tapping it, adding some dots and some lines. Again, just some randomness in there. The color that I'm using for this, of course, is the mountain color that we mixed in the first part of this video. And I just want to map in this mountain, kind of painting the same thing over again, but just doing it freehand and making it kind of squiggly and kind of soft, just to make that reflection not be a perfect replica of the image above it. And one thing I'm always thinking about is any of these darker ripples that I add in with the airbrush is going to be the shadow. So each shadow is always going to have a corresponding highlight to it. So after these are done, of course, I'm going to switch over to the eraser and then pull out paint in between these shadows. That way, each ripple in the water has a highlight and a corresponding shadow. And I'm also just spraying some paint over the canvas to darken everything up. Just get rid of that white gesso. Over to the right side of this mountain, I'm painting in the reflection of the sky. And of course, this is going to be a gradient from dark to light. But of course, since this is a reflection, it's the opposite of the sky above it. So the darkest value is going to be on the bottom. I spray more paint there, and then as it moves up toward the horizon line, it's just going to get lighter, so I spray less paint. Since I now have paint in that area, I don't want to rest my hand on it, so what I like to do is just use a piece of paper and then place that on the canvas to rest my hand on. This way, my palm's not going to touch that paint, so it doesn't lift off. It's just an easy, simple technique to keep your paintings clean. What I'm doing here with the eraser is just going into this area again and pulling out more specular highlights. A specular highlight is a direct reflection of the light source, which on a landscape, of course, is the sun. So they're going to be pretty bright. They're basically going to be pure white. So with my eraser here, I'm just tapping in a bunch of dots in these horizontal lines to give me some very bright highlights. This is super easy to do. You just want to go into your highlights that you erased out before and then just tap in some brighter ones right in the middle of them. If you only want to pull out your highlights using an electric eraser, that's fine too. I find for me that it's difficult to keep these lines completely horizontal when I'm using an electric eraser. Even if I'm using it along a ruler, it tends to want to drag up in a diagonal. So I recommend erasing out major highlights with the stick eraser, with an ink eraser. And then when you want to get in there and add some specular, some brighter highlights right in the middle, use the electric eraser. And I'm just going to continue building up texture over and over, erasing and putting down some paint. Now, what I want to move along to is the way that I painted in the reflections of these trees. And this is pretty simple and pretty straightforward. The first thing that I'm doing is going to any area where the tree is going to be reflecting on the water. Then using my eraser, I just erase into it in small circular motions, or if you want, you could use small horizontal motions. Either one will work fine. The main goal here is to add some texture in while removing that blue paint. Once that's erased out, I can go back to my airbrush and use the same color that I used to paint in the highlights on the trees. So for these individual trees, I used yellow ochre. So I'm just lightly spraying some yellow ochre into this area that I erased out. So just by adding in some texture with the eraser, then switching over to the airbrush and glazing a color on top of it, we could start adding in reflections of the trees. And as I said a few times already, one of the fun things about landscape painting is that you could constantly adjust your colors, the shapes of your trees, whatever, really to make it whatever you want. So just make sure that you remember that whatever color you painted your tree, you're going to have to use that same color for the reflection. I also see some darker trees and some darker shadows just above this reflection. So I'm using my airbrush, spraying some darker green paint and some black to fill those in. It's such a simple concept, but all you have to remember is that to pull this reflection effect together, make sure that the image you're painting in the water mimics the landscape right above it. And while you're paying attention to the hues, make sure you also pay attention to the values. Try to get your values similar in the reflection to the way the landscape is right above. One nice thing about painting reflections in water is that you just don't have to go into too much detail. You could, of course, add some texture with your eraser and then glaze some color over it, but you don't have to go crazy with the detail. A small amount will go a long way for this. And once you have those reflections in, just switch over to the eraser and start adding some horizontal lines in. Remember what I said before about linear perspective. The reflections of the trees are farther away from us than the reflection of this mountain. So I want to make sure that the ripples in this are kind of soft and smaller and not as detailed as the ones closer to us. And that, of course, just helps to create that illusion of depth. And on the right side of these reflections, I'm doing the same thing by adding some color there, then erasing into it. But this time for the reflection, I'm using burnt umber, which is that orange color, so it matches the trees. And of course, if I see any shadows in those trees, I'm replicating them in the reflection, just painting vertical lines straight down using that same color of burnt umber. So that's it for this one. That's the final part of this painting lesson. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And my two most important tips is one, don't be hard on yourself when painting. You're going to make plenty of mistakes. I make plenty of mistakes. It's just part of painting. And number two, always take your time. There's no need to rush. I know you're eager to finish the painting quickly. I get that feeling all the time. But when you slow down and take your time with it, you're going to enjoy it a lot more and the painting will come out a lot better. So thanks again, and I'll see you back here next time.